All right, we can go ahead and get started.
Great. All right, so we'll start with sourdough. So this is the loaf that we're going to be making this evening. This is a sweet potato and rosemary sourdough. And I wanted to just point out before we dive into this loaf that sourdough is actually refers to lots of different kinds of breads, not just maybe the kinds of breads that we're used to from, like sourdough from Santa Fe kind of thing. We also have things like Scandinavian rye. Injera is a form of sourdough, right, from Ethiopia. We have the San Francisco sourdough that a lot of people are familiar with. There's also things like idlis and dosas from India that also count as sourdough. This is like a souring technique and fermentation technique. All right, so how to become a great baker. Tara Jensen's one of my teachers. I've taken 2 of her courses now in Kentucky. She wrote A Baker's Year. And I love this quote from her: "Intuition is data gathered by the body over time." And I really believe that to be very true in baking. It just really takes practice, as most of you know. And Laura, I see you doing your handwork there, and you know the same thing, right? It's just practice and doing it over and over. So yeah. So building muscle memory and organoleptic skills is really going to be like the bread and butter, so to speak. Organoleptic means taste, touch, smell, like what we can discern through our senses. So experiencing your dough and making your baking process something that you can be present with is going to help your baking process. Keeping a journal is also a great idea. I keep one, especially when I have bread that goes really well. Or bread that doesn't go very well, and I'll kind of keep a journal as to like what happened. And then accepting failures as an invitation to make croutons or breadcrumbs or any other dish that requires bread as an ingredient. So just because your bread is overproofed or just because it came out with a blowout, like misshapen, that doesn't mean that it's no longer edible. Make it into something else. Baking is a collaboration with living ingredients, like Paulette was saying. So the wheat and the grains are the progeny of the living plant. So we need to think about that wheat as the seed, right? As soon as we bring water to it, that water is also pulsing with energy and journey from like its travel around wherever it's come from. And when they come together with the yeast, it becomes this coral reef that needs all the same things that we need. It needs air, it needs food, and it also needs like movement and a job. So we're creating this environment for it. And because we're doing this in a wild way, we have to be accepting of things, maybe not going the way that we planned. Embrace the mess. I'm going to show you when I do this that I do everything with my hands. I definitely recommend that because you can really feel everything a lot more, and you can tell when the grains have been fully hydrated and when the salt has been fully dissolved into the dough. When you're using instruments like a spoon, it's a bit harder to feel that. So it's going to stick to your fingers. It's going to stick to the table. It's okay. You can clean it up after. And then use what you already have. As you start to get more into bread baking, you can buy more things if you feel like you need to. But I feel like, buy them if they increase your enjoyment or they increase your ease or your success. But otherwise, try to use what you have around already. I'll show you a couple of the tools that I have, but I've tried not to get too tech heavy on tools. And I'm going to show you how to do this both in a loaf pan as well as in a banneton. All right, so flour is one of the ingredients that we need for bread. And Janet already talked about King Arthur and their amazing array of recipes. King Arthur, I feel like, is a great flour to start with, especially this bread flour, if you can get a hold of this bread flour. I know during the pandemic, it was impossible to get this, and now it's just kind of starting to come back to the shelves. Bread flour has 12.7% protein, and protein is, as we're going to see, pretty important for how much the bread can kind of stretch and rise. So whole wheat flour has more protein than that even. It's 14% protein. And you would think that having that higher protein would be a good thing. But in the case of whole wheat, you have the bran and the germ that are still in the flour, and the bran and the germ have sharp edges. And so they're gonna cut at the gluten as the gluten and the gliadin are starting to form that web. It's gonna like make these little micro incisions that make it harder for the bread to get that loft. That's why a lot of times white breads tend to be much more lofty than wheat breads that are a bit more dense. It's because of that bran that's in there, which is really healthful, but something to think about as well. So kind of thinking about your expectations of what kind of bread you are looking for. All right, so we're going to talk about baker's math just for a second because you might come across this. Is anybody familiar with baker's math already? Probably Paulette. Whoa, I don't know what that noise was. Anybody else hearing that, or is it just me?
Oh, I think I'm hearing it too.
Okay.
It could be someone's phone.
Yeah, it's probably someone who's unmuted has their phone on.
Okay.
So maybe I'm gonna mute everybody for now.
Maybe it's me.
Lacey, I have a question.
Yeah.
I came across a recipe for sourdough, and they said that rye is a better flour to use. I'm wondering why that would be.
I wouldn't say it's a better flour to use. Rye doesn't have any gluten in it. It only has gliadin in it. So it's going to ferment in a way that's kind of like more gelatinous and doesn't have as much rise. So that's when you see like 100% rye loaves, they're usually square because they usually have to be put in a mold.
Oh, okay.
So it's just like kind of a different animal, and rye has a little bit more specifics around temperatures. But what's nice about rye is that you don't have to do all this folding technique that I'm going to show you, because the rye, like you're not stretching the gluten. You don't need to stretch it the same way.
Right.
Yeah, so it's like, it's easier in that sense, but there's like some pitfalls that you can fall into with the rye.
Okay, thanks.
Yeah. All right, so baker's math is a way of looking at your ingredients and looking at your recipe, and you can kind of start tinkering around with it. You'll notice that my percentage here, my total percentage is over 200%, which, you know, we all know from regular percentage doesn't really make a whole lot of sense. But the way that baker's math works is that your flour is always 100%, and then all of your other ingredients are a percentage reflective of that flour. So if you hear someone say that they're making a sourdough that's 70% hydration or 80% hydration, like these really high hydration sourdoughs are really popular right now. And so you might hear somebody say that. This is kind of what they're talking about. And what's nice about these is that you can take something like this and then kind of work around it, or kind of make your own recipe from here. Most of the time, the salt is going to be about 2%, 1.5% to 2%, and most of the time your starter is going to be somewhere between 20 and 30%. And so from there, you can kind of start playing with some of the other components of it. Like this calls for 100% bread flour, which is that white King Arthur flour. But what I've been doing today in preparation for this is making a couple of loaves that have different percentages of wheat flour in them too, and I can kind of like play with the recipe a little bit. I just wanted to introduce you to it. It's not imperative that you know this, but you'll probably see this if you get more into sourdough. So we're going to be prepping our mind and our space for this. Usually for sourdough, I budget 3 days. My first day is really getting my starter ready, right? My second day is folding, mixing, shaping, and my third day is, you know, probably in the morning when I'm going to be baking. So this is just like if you were to leave this class at 8 o'clock and go right into making your bread. This is for this particular recipe what it would look like. You would feed your starter at 8 p.m. tonight. Tomorrow morning you would mix your dough. You would go through a series of folds, and this one is every 10 minutes. And then you would have 2-hour-long waits after doing some shaping. And then you would put it in the fridge for 8 to 12 hours, and then you would bake it the very next morning. So this would be kind of a day-long process tomorrow, and you would be baking it on Saturday morning. So I always like to make myself a little schedule like this so I can kind of keep it in mind.
Lacey,
right.
can I ask you a quick question?
Yeah.
So I'm just curious what you do. When you take it out of the fridge, do you bake it right away or do you let it warm up a little bit before you bake it?
It depends. I have the loaf, so I have 3 loaves going simultaneously for you tonight so that you can see one in the oven, one in the beginning, and one kind of midway. And the one that is going to go in the oven tonight, I already took out and I put it on the stove to kind of warm up as the oven warms up. Partially, I did that because I'm going to be baking this one in a glass Pyrex. And so I want the glass to kind of heat up a little bit before I put it in the oven. Partly I did that because I wanted to see how proofed it was and if it needed to kind of wake up a little bit. This one looks pretty proofed. I could have left it in the oven or in the fridge and gone right to the oven from there. When I do it in a Dutch oven, like from a Banneton to a Dutch oven, I often don't let it come up to temperature at all. I put it right into a hot Dutch oven that's already preheated.
Okay, thanks.
Yeah, I find that temperature shift does help with rise.
Lacey, I have a question.
Yeah.
Do you find a difference between glass or metal containers? You say you're putting this one in Pyrex because before you were doing it in metal, I think. Is there a difference at all in how it rises or anything?
Not necessarily that I've noticed. No, I just don't really like the metal that I have is like not. I don't know. I don't feel like it's what I want to use for like the contact that it has with the bread and like possible leaching. But I'd rather use something like ceramic or cast iron or glass.
Okay.
Yeah, because this is just like that. The one that I was using was like more of like a cheap, cheaper aluminum one. Maybe not aluminum, but whatever they make those out of. All right, so what is a starter? So it sounds like some of you already have a starter, which is lovely. So your starter is that environment that we're creating, right? And we're keeping that culture alive throughout multiple bakes, throughout, multiple years, hopefully. But also know that starters sometimes can die if you leave them in the fridge for too long, or if they just start to not smell so good anymore or not taste so good. Like it's totally acceptable to compost it and start over. So don't feel attached to your starter, for if you feel sentimental, that's fine. But if you feel like you have to keep it, know that you can start over, and having a new flour and new water is a great way to kind of refresh everything if you're not getting the rise or the flavor or texture that you're looking for anymore. So basically a starter is equal parts of flour and water and a little bit of that live culture. So when it's time to feed the starter or maintain the starter, we're going to discard most of it. And Janet was telling us that we can put that into crackers, we can put that into scones or anything else. There's lots of different discard recipes, and that's what they're talking about, is they're talking about taking that discard and putting it into something else. Generally, I will only use discard that smells and tastes good. If it has, become kind of alcoholic smelling or smells, kind of like vinegary, I'm not going to use it. I'm going to discard it to the compost. But if it smells and tastes fresh and you're not ready to make bread, you can freeze it, or you can, make it into crackers and freeze that cracker dough, or you can, make all kinds of things. I make pancakes just with the discard, and I throw all kinds of things in the pancakes. So that's a great way to use it. So to feed it, you're going to give it equal parts flour and water. I usually do 100 grams of water and 100 grams of bread flour. Mix it well, and then let it ferment. The time that it needs to ferment depends on your room. It depends on how hot your room is. Generally, this is 6 to 12 hours, but it can be as little as 2 in Florida or Costa Rica if it's hot. So you really just kind of have to watch it and see how it's reacting. And then repeat this as long as it's on the counter. When you put it in the fridge, you're putting it to rest, but it is going to keep fermenting in the fridge. So when you take it out, if it's been a week since you've had it in there, it might not have a very pleasant smell anymore, and it might not pass the float test, in which case it's time to discard some of it and feed it again. Basically what it means when you have that smell and taste that's no longer good is just that the yeast has already eaten through all of its available food, and it's letting off its waste product, and it's in some senses it's dying, so it's ready to be fed. All right, so here's in pictures how you feed your starter, right? Equal parts water and flour, a little bit of the starter from previously. You're letting it ripen. You're waiting for it to get nice and bubbly. And then you can do a float test, which I'll show you in just a minute. Here's a float test picture.
Hey, Lacey,
Yes.
do you ever use 50 grams of flour and 50 grams of water to like conserve flour?
I don't. And the reason that I don't do that is that if you underfeed your starter for a prolonged period of time, you're in essence, you're starving it. So giving it these kind of like large feedings is a way to really like boost its health. And you'll be able to taste and smell eventually that like, that it's getting exhausted by just like never having quite enough food. So what I would recommend maybe instead is like getting into a habit of freezing your discard, or, you know, feeding it once or twice and then doing your bake and then feeding it and putting it in the fridge.
Mm-hmm.
So like not keeping it on the counter, because the longer you keep it on the counter, the more you have to feed it.
Yeah,
Does that make sense?
that makes sense. Thanks.
Yeah. I know. I really struggled with this a lot too in the beginning of baking, of like, oh, I don't want to throw away that flour. And it's like, it's hard. It like hurts your soul to like feel like you're overfeeding it, but it is, you'll see it in the long term that like it won't be a very healthy starter if you're kind of underfeeding it.
Yeah.
So what we're looking for a healthy starter is these kind of soap bubbles and a bready smell, like nice and fresh, nutty, bready. Here's a couple of tools that you might decide to get eventually. You don't need to have them. These are bannetons here on the left. On the bottom right is just a lame, L-A-M-E, is basically just like a fancy X-Acto knife. And then the top right is a Dutch oven. And what's really nice about a Dutch oven, and why I do like to bake with a Dutch oven, is that when you put that top on, it really traps in all the steam. And for the first 20 minutes of baking, you keep that top on and then you take it off. And I have really overproofed bread before and really kind of messed up my bread. And when I put it in that Dutch oven, it's like magic, because the steam and the intense heat from preheating that really does a wonder on the dough, regardless of what I've done to the dough.
Lacey, I have a question.
Yeah.
For the baskets on the left there, what are they made out of?
Some sort of like a wicker type of material, like some sort of like light balsa wood kind of.
Okay. And that allows air to come in, or why do you use those?
Well, so I think some of the different reasons why that they're used is that it creates a nice shape. And if you take the liner out of it, you can get those really nice circles on the top of the bread, because you're going to be coating this in flour. So when you put the dough in there, it's going to pick up those rings and it makes a really beautiful image. But also it's just like a gentle shape. And most of the things that we have in our homes, like bowls, don't tend to have this gentle shape. And so it can kind of lead to a bread that just gets, you know, too long or too fat. And then it's like hard for it to get lift. So these are designed like at a certain grade.
Oh, okay. Thanks.
It's not necessary though. Like you can make them in bowls. All right, tools to consider. Parchment paper. If you're gonna be doing this in a Dutch oven, parchment paper is really nice. A sharp blade, bannetons if you're interested. A Dutch oven with an oven-proof lid. Some of them don't have an oven-proof lid, or like the handle on them is not oven-proof, so make sure you have one that can fully go into the oven. Spray bottle of water. So if you're not gonna be using a Dutch oven, you might want to spray the inside of your oven so you can create steam. And I use just like just a little spray bottle, a scale, and a bench scraper. And you'll see those in a minute and why those are important. And then here's getting creative with discards. Just go ahead and Google it. There's lots of good things out there. These are a couple of folks that I really enjoy following and have some great books. Chef Brian Ford just came out with New World Sourdough, and I really enjoy his books a lot, or his book and his Instagram a lot. He's really informative on his Instagram. Sarah Owens, I have all of her books, and she creates such beautiful masterpieces of bread, and she's a forager, and she incorporates herbs into her bread, and she was the like head rose gardener at the Brooklyn Botanical Garden, so she puts all kinds of botanicals into her bread, and they're really just gorgeous. And then Tara Jensen is kind of my direct mentor, and she has all kinds of great classes that you can go to. And then her Instagram, actually, she often does Instagram stories where you can ask her questions and she'll answer those questions live. All right. So let's get into doing some hands-on stuff. Hey, Phil. I'm gonna get my cameraman. Hold on just a second. Come on. Why won't you let me make it?
It's an email.
Should I not have sent it as an email?
I find them pretty hard to.
Can I forward it to? How do I? No.
Lacey,
Just
do
a
you want
second,
me to
guys.
send you a link?
Can you text me a link?
Yeah, I can do that.
Thank you. Technology. Nothing. So while we wait, I've already pre-roasted my sweet potatoes. I roasted them with the skins on, and I just kind of like put some coconut oil around them so that the skins would stay soft, and then I just roasted them whole that way. And the recipe calls for, it says like medium sweet potatoes, but these are small sweet potatoes. Like this is not a very big sweet potato. All right.
Did you grow it, Lacey?
I didn't grow these, no. We partner with a farm here called Full Cellar Farm in Jefferson, and I get all of my vegetables from them.
Oh, I also wanted to mention that some friends of mine and I love King Arthur flour, but I also wanted to mention that we have been buying some flour, fresh milled flour from the McGrash mill up in Baltimore County, and their flour is wonderful. It's expensive, but it's really wonderful flour.
That's what I use too, yeah, I love it.
If you have a link, can you put that in the chat? McGrash, M-C-G-R-A-S-H, I think.
M-I-G-R-A-S-H, McGrash mill.
Thanks.
They're actually kosher too. And if you spend enough money, they'll deliver for free.
Okay, we all good now? I think my case might need to be moved down a little bit. There we go. All right. All good? I can't hear anything, so.
Yeah, all good.
Yep, you're good.
You can't hear us?
Now I can. Okay.
Okay.
All right, great. So I'm going to go ahead and start weighing everything into the bowl. Let's look at the sourdough and see how the starter is doing. You can see on the side here that we're getting all these nice bubbles. I fed this at 8 o'clock, 8:30 this morning. And we'll do the float test just to kind of see. I feel like this could go a little bit longer, honestly, but I bet it will pass the float test. It feels nice and pillowy. Yeah, that's what I'm looking for. And when I lift it, like when I feel it, like it just feels like it's full of air. Like that's why it's floating, right? Because it's full of air. So that's what I'm looking for in the float test. And that tells me that it's ready. What you do need to be careful with the float test is sometimes you grab it too hard and you squish all the air out of it. So when you go to grab it, like get your fingers a little wet first and just kind of pull a piece out, but don't smash it, kind of hold it more like this. That way it'll float, because sometimes you can give yourself a false negative by just not pulling it out of the container correctly. All right, so here's the King Arthur bread flour, the 12.7%, and I've got that in this big container here. And then in this larger container, I have the Migrash red fife, and that's the one that Janet was just talking about. I am going to use a little bit of both. What's nice about using just the white flour to start, if you're new to sourdough, is just that when you start to put whole grains in, they're less forgiving. They're a little harder to work with. You can totally make this bread with whole grains. You just might get something that like doesn't have the kind of body that you're looking for. So when you first start, it might be nice to start with this, this King Arthur, and then kind of eventually start moving into doing more and more of the whole grain. So I'm going to do 150 of the Migrash red fife. So this is 150 out of the 500. If you're doing this at home, you can just do 500 of the bread flour, the Migrash bread flour. There's 150. I'm going to put the rest as the King Arthur till we get to 500. All right, so here's our 500. Next, we need 8 grams of salt. I'm using a Himalayan pink salt. You can use whatever salt you like. All right.
Lacey, does your scale automatically adjust for the weight of the container?
No, I have to tare it.
Okay.
And then we're going to do 8 grams of rosemary. Instead of rosemary, you could do basil or oregano. I feel like coriander seed, like crushed coriander seed would be really beautiful in this. Black pepper would be really nice in this. You could do some sort of like a hard cheese instead. All right, so I'm just gonna cut that up. I feel like orange zest would also be really good in this. Or capers. Ooh, a roasted garlic. All right, so now I have my dried. I'm just gonna, with my hand, kind of get it going. Mix that up in there. All right, and now we need, I'm gonna tare it again. We need 225 grams of sweet potato, so I'm gonna pull the skin off. Just dump that in there. That's 85. There's a little bit more in here. So we didn't quite make it to 225, but grams are small. I'm not worried. We're at 215. All right, and then we need 150 grams of our starter. A little too much. All right, and the last thing is going to be warm water, like 90-degree water. And we need 225 grams of water. So we're doing equal parts water and sweet potato for this. All right, great. All right, so we have everything in here. And now I'm just going to use my hand and use kind of like a, you know, a Pac-Man motion. So recipe says to, like, you know, do the sweet potato, like all the, you know, wet stuff in one bowl and all the dry stuff in another. I don't bother with that personally, but you certainly can. Because I'm using my hand, I'm making sure that I'm really getting it quite incorporated, so I'm not too worried about it. If you're going to be using a spoon, then you might want to do it separately and then put it together.
For a younger generation, you're going to have to change your analogy there.
What analogy?
The Pac-Man.
Oh, the Pac-Man. That's not a thing anymore?
No, I don't think so.
What's a good young person analogy, Anthony?
I don't know.
All right, so here it is getting all over my hands. Like I said, it's getting on the table. Don't worry about it. This is really going to build your hand muscles. And then every so often, I'm kind of trying to pull the whole thing because I see all this flour down here. I'm trying to kind of pull the whole thing and get like the wet part on that and kind of pull that in so I can keep working that in. And I'm using my hand to just kind of try to get the dry stuff off the sides. I'll say that this one is a strong bread. Like sometimes they come together really fast, but I think the sweet potato in this in particular makes it like starchy and like you really have to work your hand a bit. All right, so we're almost there, but I'm looking at all these like little, you know, bits of flour that aren't fully hydrated.
I would have thought the sweet potato would add a lot more moisture to it, though, too.
Yeah. You know, I bet it depends on which sweet potato you use, too. Like different sweet potatoes have, you know, different sweetness. Like the purple ones, the Japanese, like white fleshed ones are really sweet. But I feel like can be like a little drier sometimes.
Sure, yeah, especially those, yeah.
Yeah. All right, we're almost there. All right, now I'm just gonna use my hand to kind of like lift up from the bottom and make sure that I've gotten everything off the bottom. Pull the whole thing out and flip it over. All right. Good. I'm gonna get this off. All right, now that's gonna sit for 10 minutes, and then we'll come back to it to start turning it or folding it. While we're doing that, while we're waiting for that, I'm gonna put the other loaf in the oven. All right, so let's go over to the oven and kind of see where that's at. So I've got just like a, brownie pan. Put that on the bottom and get that preheating for a few minutes. Here's the loaf that I made this morning. So I started this morning, and it's been in the fridge now for, a good 8 to 10 hours. And it's got some nice like bubbly, body to it. And if I poke it, it starts to spring back slowly, but it holds the indent. That's how I know it's ready. If I put my finger in and it just kind of collapses, then it's overproofed. And if I try to put my finger in and it immediately comes back out and doesn't leave any impression, then it's really underproofed. It's not ready. Like I said, this could probably go a little bit longer, but it's pretty close to ready. So at this point, I can score it, and I can also kind of get myself ready with my little spray bottle. And I'll also be throwing some water into that pan. Now, if I was going to be doing this in the cast iron, at this point, I would have preheated the oven with this inside of it, and I wouldn't have that brownie pan in there at all. It would just be this. And I would have my bread in here, and I would put my piece of parchment paper on the table, and I would just, go whoop right onto the parchment paper, cut my bread, do my scoring, and then that parchment paper I would take over to the oven, lift off the top, and lower it into the cast iron, put the top on. So that's the difference if you're doing it in a banneton and a cast iron. But because I'm not using the cast iron, I'm going to create lift with steam.
Would you spray inside the cast iron pot or not? Spray water?
Nope, you don't need to, because the cast iron locks in all of the steam that's coming off the bread. All right, so just a few minutes, that already heated up really well. I'm going to give that a second to kind of fill this chamber with steam. Oftentimes when I'm doing it in a loaf, I actually don't even score it, but I am going to score it this time.
Can you do it on the table?
Yeah. So I'm going to just do like a few quick cuts. And you don't want to go too deep, but you want to go deep enough that you do start to see this split here. And this one, I kind of dragged it a little too much here, so you can see that it got a little ragged. It's not a big deal. You'll get better at it over time. And because I didn't do this right out of the fridge, it's a little more gummy. If you do it right out of the fridge, it's much easier to do this and you get much cleaner lines. All right, so it's going in the oven. It's going on the top shelf here. I'm using this to steam. And I'm going to give myself 5 minutes, and then I'm going to steam it again. So this is kind of simulating what it would be like to have the top on, or to have this in like a steam oven like bakeries have. All right, so you can see this one that we just made is really shaggy, right? Like it's together, but it's pretty shaggy. Let's look at this one. This one I started at 5:30, right? And you can see that it's already starting to get kind of like a glossiness to it. And at this point, this one is still in the process of being folded. Like if I was following the schedule, I would have finished folding this one already, but we were talking, so I'll show you like what the next step is, because I've only folded this twice. So I got my fingers a little bit wet, not super wet. I'm not trying to introduce a bunch of water, but I'm just going to show you two different ways of folding. So one is a turn and fold in the bowl, and it looks like this. You're going to kind of use your fingers to get under the bread and lift it and fold it over. And then you turn the bread, lift it, fold it over, lift it, fold it over, and lift it one more time and fold it over. So really what you're doing is like stretching the gluten and trying to get it to make bonds, break those bonds, make bonds, and they can build better bonds. The other technique that I like to use is called slap and fold. Slap and fold is difficult and not really probably advised to use when you're using like whole grains. Like if I was using all McGrath grains, I probably wouldn't use slap and fold because it would just not be strong enough probably. So for this one, because I'm using a good bit of the King Arthur, getting just a little bit of water, again, just really trying to get it like a little bit wet so that it's slick, but I'm not trying to get, introduce a lot of water to this. I'm gonna throw it on there. I'm gonna pick it up from the top, slap it down, and fold it over. Pick it up from now the side. So I've made a little roll here, right? You can see this is like a little roll. I'm gonna pick it up from the right side, slap it down, fold it over. Pick it up from the right side, slap it down, fold it over. And then I'm just gonna kind of shape it by pulling it and using my hands to kind of trap almost a tiny bit of the bread under my hand and pull it so I can create tension in the bread here. This is what is called a gluten coat. We're trying to create like a tight, tense coat. There are some little tears here you can see. Part of that is because we're using, things like rosemary. And so there's like actual things in the bread that can tear it. And part of that is just because I just folded it two different ways in one time. And the gluten is still kind of fragile. So I'm gonna put this back in the bowl. In 10 minutes, we'll fold it again, and that'll be our final fold for this one, and then I can show you how to shape it. All right. So let's go to this one. This is the one that we just made. Looks real shaggy. I'm gonna start to pull it together with the first fold. All right, that's the first fold. Still looks shaggy. That's all right, it's just the first one. All right, now we'll go over and check on the bread that's in the oven. Wash your hands. Okay, I'm gonna open it up. If you wanna come this way, just so you can see the bread. I'm being careful not to shoot the water at that back light in the oven because I don't want to like explode the light. But the reason that we're trying to create steam is because we want to create flexibility in the crust before it sets. If there's no steam, sometimes what happens is that the crust will bake too quickly and you won't be able to get rise. So what's happening when it's baking is that the water that's inside of it is vaporizing and mechanically kind of like pushing up on the bread. And so we're trying to use that lift, that like actual like vaporization that's happening to lift it. But if we don't have steam to kind of keep things soft and supple, then it can just get too crusty and then it'll rip instead. That's what we're doing. All right, we have a few minutes, so let's feed the sourdough. All right, so we used, almost all of the sourdough. There's very little left. This is normal for me. This is how I like to keep it. So I'm making, making a full batch every time, and I'm putting almost the entire batch into my bread or into my biscuits or whatever I'm making. And what's left is really just like a tiny bit at the bottom. That's all you need. During COVID, during the lockdown of COVID, I couldn't find bread flour, and so I was using meagrash flour, and my sourdough starter wasn't very happy about it. It started to get kind of weak, and it just like didn't have the right kind of like bubbly, toasty smell that I was used to. So however you want to start your sourdough, like that's what it's gonna keep wanting to be fed. So if you want to only ever use like, you know, local stone milled, then you probably want to start your sourdough that way, and kind of keep it going that way. But even still, like folks that I know that that make, you know, whole grain sourdough often will use some of this kind of roller milled in with it, because it just seems to like it. It's more available nutrients, I guess.
Lisa, can you talk a little bit about what happens when if your sourdough's in the fridge and you get a layer of liquid on top? I know there are some people who pour it off and some people who stir it back in.
Yeah. Yeah. So people call that the hooch layer, right? Because it gets like an alcoholic taste and smell.
Right.
Personally, I pour that off because I don't want my bread to taste and smell that way. So I don't keep that, because that's in essence what we talked about. That's like the yeast cells are dying and they're underfed and they're starving, and so they're creating this this byproduct that, in my opinion, doesn't taste and smell the way I want it to for my bread. So I don't put it back in. I take it off.
Lacey, at what point do you always use that same container, or do you ever start your starter in a new container?
I do start it in a new container, especially as it just starts to get crusty.
Okay.
Yeah, so I have, let's see, this one I've been using for a while, and it's real crusty around the edges. This one I actually just started today. You can see that the edges are still fairly clean.
Sure.
Yeah, so I do like every, you know, if I'm baking bread a lot, like every couple of bakes, maybe I might switch to a new container. You don't have to, like some people don't do that. And a lot of people like to do it in like the plastic takeout containers, and they don't clean it out. I just find that it gets like too messy for me. So I've got the flour and the water in here in equal parts, 100 grams of each. And now I'm just using a chopstick to really make sure that I'm fully incorporating it. I'm getting off the sides. And now I'll let this ferment on the counter for however long it takes. But at this time of year, because it's starting to get cold and our house isn't heated yet, it probably will be a good 10, maybe 12 hours even before it's ready for use again. Although I could use it earlier, like if I'm going to make a pancake or going to make a discard. But if I'm making bread, something that I really want to rise, I'm going to try to wait and time it correctly. And that's just, again, kind of like being present with it and kind of seeing how it changes through the seasons. In the summer, it's much faster. And when it's humid out, it's much faster. Okay. Alrighty. So let's go back to this one.
There's no timer on.
There's no timer on. I know. I'm just going to kind of keep looking at it. Yeah.
Cool.
Okay. So I'm going to go back to this one. This one's looking pretty good. I'm going to go ahead and show you how to fold this one so that we can kind of keep moving through the process, or excuse me, how to shape this one. So let's assume that I've folded this 4 times. And after that 4th time, I let it sit for an hour, because that's what it says in the recipe. So fold it every 10 minutes, 4 times, and then let it sit for an hour. So I've let it do that. This time, instead of using water, I'm going to use a little bit of flour. And I'm gonna turn it out. And this is what we call the pre-shape. So I'm trying to build tension again, trying to give it the shape that I want it to have long term. So I'm gonna kind of stretch it out a little bit and middle up and push it in. And then I'm gonna take the two sides and fold them over. And then I'm gonna take the whole bottom and kind of flip it over and then do that same technique where I'm kind of pulling underneath. So I'm trying to stretch that gluten cloak without tearing it to the best of my ability and build tension. All right, so that's my finished pre-shape. You can see it's nice and like, you know, kind of bows in and nice and fluffy, soft. And I'm gonna stick that back in the bowl. And according to the recipe, we're waiting 1 more hour before we do a final shape and put it in the fridge. We'll probably speed that up so we can do it together. So we'll put that one to the side. See how nice and soft this one looks. And let's go back to our shaggy one. I'm gonna do the slap and fold this time. Just so you can see the slap and fold kind of and how effective it is, but you can definitely do all of your turning and folding in the bowl. I'm getting my hands a little bit wet. All right, so this is our second fold. All right, so I'm making it into kind of like a little square. Pick it up from the top, slap it down, fold it over. Pick it up from the side, slap it down, fold it over. Pick it up from the side, slap it down, fold it over. Pick it up from the side, slap it down, fold it over. You can see already that that coat got much glossier. Now I'm going to use that technique again of kind of pulling it towards me. And I'm going to stick it back in the bowl. So I'm going to give it 10 minutes and then we'll do that again. So that was 2 out of the 4 folds. Do y'all have any questions so far? It's not that different from making yeasted bread, right?
I want to mention that your loaves, your balls, whatever you want to call them, look absolutely beautiful.
Thanks. Thank you. That technique of like pulling, I feel like makes a really nice coat on it, and that's something that has taken me a long time to like figure out, because in the beginning I feel like I wasn't very dexterous with it. And one thing I feel like, if I can give you a piece of advice, everyone, is like be quick with your movements, but also be like confident with your movements. It's almost like the bread can feel like when you're nervous and like it like loses all of its tension and like flattens itself out to make it like more sticky and difficult for you. Like move with like intention and as if you know exactly what you're doing, and it's like the bread responds to that. I don't know how else to explain.
So Lacey, I've also seen some people use the bench scraper in one hand and then their hand to sort of create that tension instead of pulling it like you were doing. So have you ever tried doing it that way?
Yeah, I have tried it that way, and I'm not as practiced in that, and so I find that more difficult. Yeah.
Okay.
It's like a pulling and turning that you do at the same time. I'll try it on the next one. But yeah, I've been taught that technique, and I don't find it as easy for me, but I'll definitely try it. Yeah. Do you like to use that technique?
Sometimes. I actually prefer to cup on one side, cup my hand on one side, and then rotate, and then cup my hand and then rotate instead of pulling. That seems to work for me. So I am creating tension with one hand and then holding it with the other.
Nice, nice.
Yeah.
Yeah,
I think-
however it works.
Yeah.
However it works is all you're looking for, yeah. All right, let's go check on the oven. Normally I wouldn't open the oven a bunch, but we're doing a class, so let's just kind of like see what's happening in there. All right, so it's nice and tall. I can see that my my scores here did break a little bit. This one looks nice, but this one is a little bit broken. That's not really a big deal, but as it kind of started to harden, that crust didn't stay soft enough. Smells great though. That's our dog. Are you giving her a little moment?
It's too bad Zoom doesn't have a smell button on it, you know?
I know. You'll just have to trust me, it smells good.
It smells like rosemary.
Yeah. All right, so I'm gonna get this banneton ready. And when you're using the bannetons, regardless of whether you use the liner or not, you wanna make sure that you're putting plenty of flour in the banneton so that you're not gonna have your dough stick to it. And I don't wash these. I think that it's good to kind of build up like a crust over time, or like a layer of flour. It's kind of like cast iron, right? Like you build it up over time, and over time you don't even really need to put anything in there anymore because it just works on its own.
You don't have to worry about it getting moldy or anything?
I've never had a problem with mold, but what I have had a problem with was like some little like insect fly kind of things, like were eating the flour. And that was an issue. And I washed out all of my bannetons, and I thought that I dried them well. And then I put them in plastic thinking like, oh, I'll protect them from the flies. And they all molded. So I had to throw away all my bannetons because they were like every color of mold, like blue, black, green, purple, like every color of mold. So.
Do you ever use rice flour with your wheat flour in your banneton?
I've never done that. Have you used
Yeah.
rice flour?
I have, because I read somewhere that it doesn't burn as much as wheat flour does, and it also gives it a little bit of a granular outside to your bread too, kind of like semolina would or cornmeal, but not as granular as those two. So I tend to make a mixture of wheat and rice flour, but that's only because that's what I was taught to do.
Yeah. Oh, interesting. No, I've not done that. When I do gluten-free sourdough, I'll use a brown rice flour for sourdough, or like I'll do a mix of brown rice and buckwheat. But I've never incorporated brown rice into my gluten sourdough. That's cool. I will think about that. I will think about using that.
Yeah, so it's just in the banneton. It's not in the dough itself.
Gotcha. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Just like okay. All right. So let's pretend that our sourdough, that's ready for shaping has been pre-shaped for an hour. And we're going to give it a final shape and then couche it. I'm going to take out that pre-shaped one. And there's plenty of different ways that you can go about doing this. I'm trying to make it into a longer roll. So the way that I like to do that is to make like a teardrop shape. So I kind of take these two bottom pieces and I fold those in, and then I kind of pull and press and pull and press and pull and press until I get this kind of like longer shape. And then I'll do that same kind of pulling to tighten it. And then I'll just kind of like roll the bottoms in, smash them in a little bit, and then pull it into the right shape. So for the banneton, we're going to put it in upside down. So here's where, for me, I would use my bench knife and kind of flip it upside down and stick it in that banneton. And from here, I'm gonna stick it right into the refrigerator. I'm gonna let this sit out because it hasn't had its kind of full time. So I'm gonna let it sit out for another, 30 minutes or so. And then I'm going to use a damp towel that I get wet under the water in the sink, and then kind of, strain it out so that it's just damp. And I'm gonna lay that over top of the bread and stick it in the refrigerator for the night. All right, let's go back to this one. We'll do a slap and fold again on this one. All right, let's see. Yeah, I'm not good at that one, Janet. That one doesn't work for me. It's like a twist.
And I also wonder if the surface you're working on is different too. Like,
Yeah.
I have a wooden pastry board that I work on. And
Yeah.
it's a little bit different than working on a granite surface too.
Yeah. I think I'm just like real used to this one.
Well, no, I understand. And for me, I've been flying blind. So it's really wonderful for me to watch you do this because you have so much more experience than I do.
I do want to learn that technique though, because it looks so fancy. All right, so that was our fourth. That was our third. That was our third go with that one. So that one we'll get one more, and then it'll sit for an hour.
This goes without saying, but as an observer, I really enjoy watching bakers do this 1,000 different ways on Instagram. There's little videos of them shaping bread, and it's fun to watch all the different ways.
Yeah, and when I was learning, this recipe that I've given you is for one loaf, but when I was learning, I would always make 4 loaves at a time. Not because we needed 4 loaves in the house, but just because it helps with muscle memory to do it all at one time. And so I would be folding 4 at a time and shaping 4 at a time. And that way, like in that, 5 hours that I've put aside to do this, I'm getting a lot of practice. And then you give bread away and everybody loves you. And, the first ones that I would give away were like this big. They hadn't risen at all because my sourdough, I was chronically using my sourdough when it was underfed, and I was chronically underfeeding it. And so it just wasn't getting the lift that I was looking for. And it took me a while to figure out that that's what was happening, that like my sourdough wasn't healthy. So I just wasn't getting the right kind of experience that I was looking for. If you want to see some unhealthy sourdough, let me grab my rye sourdough so you can see what that looks like. Oof, shameful. Shameful. So rye is kind of a different beast altogether, right? Like because it doesn't have the gluten in it, it only has the gliadin in it. Like it's going to stay kind of like jammy and soft. And when you make your sourdough starter, like this is really dry because it's just been in the fridge forever. But what you're looking for usually with the sourdough starter isn't this like these beautiful bubbles on top and this kind of like stretch that you get out of it. What you're looking for with the rye sourdough is like a cracking on the top. So it should look like a little bit of bubbles on the side, which we have none because this has been in the fridge for way too long, and like a little bit of a crack on the top and like little blowholes, almost like, it looks like a whale came up and like had like a little blowhole. But you're not going to get like this massive amount of bubbles like this. This is my brown rice starter, also very dry. So this is what it looks like when it's been way too long in the fridge. It's like a little hockey puck now. But I don't see like crazy, I don't see any crazy mold on this. So what I would do at this point for the brown rice starter is I would pour this into a bowl, a clean bowl, and then break off a little piece of the brown rice starter, discard the rest, and feed it maybe like a large amount, like 150 grams of brown rice flour and water. And the reason that I would feed it so much is that I really want it to have like an abundance of time to kind of make up for all the time that I've not been paying attention to it. So I don't want it to go into a place of scarcity again until I put it back in the fridge. The same for the rye. I would take a tiny bit of this out because I don't see any mold in here. And honestly, I've done it plenty of times where I have seen mold, and I just dig down to where there's no mold at the bottom, and I'll take that. But as I'm kind of getting deeper into baking, I'm also realizing that like sometimes flavors get compromised in a way that like is really hard to come back from. And now I'm a bit more, just a bit more curious about kind of like tasting and touching and smelling it. And if I feed it once or twice and it's not coming back, then I'm likely to just kind of discard it and start over.
So the fact that it's dried out doesn't mean it's dead. It's just in hibernation state or something?
Basically, yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, but I would feed it to be sure of that, right? If I feed it and nothing happens, then it's like, okay, maybe it's dead. But when it's really, really dead, it's usually just like, it's turned black. Like something else has parasitized it. That's more likely to happen when it's like totally dead.
Okay.
Yeah. This doesn't smell bad at all. No.
And those were covered in the fridge?
Yeah, they were just covered with a, with a cloth on it, which is why they got, dried out. But yeah, I never cover my sourdough unless I'm traveling with it. I'll always just put a cloth over it because I want it to have respiration. And really, like, what's cool about these little chips, like this wasn't like healthy, like just bad starter, but like these little chips are actually like part of history, right? Because like this is how a lot of sourdough has been traveled around the world, is like literally to like brush it onto a handkerchief and let that handkerchief dry, and then to fold that handkerchief up, stick it in your, in your clothing with you, or like in your bag. And then like, that's how so much sourdough migrated with so many different people, but especially like this sourdough, like from, my family lineage of like, Sweden or Ireland, like it would have come probably in a dry form like this. And then they would have rehydrated it when they got to the place where they're going to bake again. All right. You can see there's like little bubbles in here even. Let's see how the bread in the oven's doing. All right, so we're starting to get a nice color crust on here. Right, I want it to be like pretty dark. I don't feel like that's dark enough yet for my taste. All right. One thing about using the cast iron is that it's pretty common for the bottom to get burnt. So one thing that I'll do if I don't want the bottom to get burnt, I personally don't really mind the bottom getting burnt. I like that flavor. But if I'm making it for someone else and I don't want that to happen, I'll do the first 20 minutes in the cast iron with the lid on. Then I'll take the lid off, and I'll do the next like 10 minutes or so in the cast iron, still on that piece of parchment paper. And then for the last 10, 15 minutes, I'll lift it out of there on the parchment paper and put it either directly on the rack, or I'll have like a little baking stone that I'll put on there. And it's really just because like the cast iron is so good at conducting the heat that it's much more likely to burn the bottom in this. But that, again, that's like an aesthetic thing. Like I don't mind that at all.
When you say burnt, you mean burnt black or just very, very brown?
Burnt black.
Okay.
Yeah. Yeah. And then how to know when your bread is done. Like people talk about like tapping the bottom and like seeing if it's hollow. That's one way to do it. You can also use a thermometer like this. Like some people will use a thermometer to see if it's like, 212 degrees in there or something like that. Honestly, I've found that just doing it enough times and testing it myself and like kind of seeing, oh, I took it out when it was kind of like nutty brown and golden, and when I cut into it, it still felt a little too soft or like too wet. So I'll let it go longer the next time. And that's again what the journal is really great for, is just kind of like writing that down and over time developing the technique to like also the courage to just leave it in long enough. I will say that sourdough, unlike yeasted breads, sourdough bread does tend to be a wetter finish. The crumb is going to be a little more wet and hydrated just naturally. Like that's just how wild fermented sourdoughs tend to be, is like a little bit more squishy, a little bit more hydrated than what you might be used to with a yeasted dough. That's all I have to say about that. All right. All right, so it's really getting nice and curly. What's that?
Have you ever gotten a sourdough starter from another place that just didn't work in your environment? Anything from Florida or somewhere, across the country?
No, I've never had that problem. But I also think that like what kind of more recent research on sourdough has shown that like your environment will quickly change your starter. So like you can take a sourdough starter from San Francisco, but when you bring it to Maryland, like it's going to pretty quickly shift to that environment.
Another thing that has happened to me is I've had kombucha going and I've had my sourdough going in the same room, and they like crossbred. So the sourdough ended up tasting like kombucha.
Yeah.
So just being aware of the different yeasts that are in the air.
Yeah. That's a good reminder. It's not always what you want. All right. Well, other than taking this guy out of the oven, like those are the techniques I wanted to make sure everybody got to see, was like the pre-shaping, final shaping, and kind of that pulling technique. Does anyone have any other questions or any other like if you're trying to think through like how you're going to do this later? Do you have any other things that are kind of coming up as like concerns?
Hey, can you repeat how you don't get the bottom to burn with the Dutch ovens?
Yes. Yeah. So I do it in the Dutch oven for 20 minutes, and then I take the top off and do it for another 10 minutes. And then I move it, because I put it in here on a piece of parchment paper, like the bread was on a piece of parchment paper before I lowered it in here. I pull that parchment paper up and put it on directly on the rack, still in the oven, for another 10 to 15 minutes, or I put it on like a hearth stone, like a pizza stone that's already been in the oven, and do it for the next 10 to 15 minutes.
Okay, thanks.
Yeah.
Lacey, another option is I have done it in a enameled cast iron like that at Le Creuset, but I also have a Emile Henry ceramic Dutch oven. And because the ceramic does something different with the moisture, it's also, for me, it's lighter weight Dutch oven to carry than the Le Creuset is. And I've had some really wonderful results in the ceramic Dutch oven.
Nice. Yeah. I have a ceramic one too that's actually meant for baking apples, but it works perfectly for bread. So yeah, ceramic is another alternative, and it doesn't seem to conduct quite as much heat so fast into the crust.
Very porous, so it might have less contact.
It's more porous, yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah.
maybe.
Yeah. All right. So let's go ahead and take this one out. All right, so you can see that we've gotten some nice rise on it. You can stick it on the other table if you think that's better. For my personal preference, I would go a little darker than this, but like you can, it's very hard. So it's plenty cooked. And I'm gonna let it sit for a good 10 to 15 minutes before I try to take it out of here. Just because if I try to take it out right now, it's just like, it's really tight in there. And if I give it another 10 to 15 minutes, it'll start to pull away from the sides, and I can use a knife to just kind of run around the sides and then dump it out onto a cooling rack. As tempting as it is to cut into this now, technically the inside of your bread is still cooking for the next hour. So you want to wait at least an hour of it cooling before you cut into it. That said, like, it's really joyous to cut it open and like put butter or whatever on there and like let it get all melty. So like, do what you want to do, but just know that like the finished product isn't for another hour after it, it needs another hour.
Can you show us what the bottom looks like?
Show you what the bottom looks like? Yeah.
Oh, okay. Yeah.
Yeah.
It's just...
I never have a problem in the glass one. I never have a problem with burning. And ever since I like destroyed my bannetons by washing them and then molding them, I've been cooking in a loaf pan, and I really enjoy it. Like, there's some things, right, like this issue that I had here with it like ripping before it could really like form. That happens more often to me now in a loaf pan. So I'm still kind of like figuring out the kinks of a loaf pan, because I've been working with bannetons and the Dutch oven for years. That like, this is still very new to me. Like, this is just since COVID basically. But I also know that a lot of people don't have a Dutch oven or bannetons at home. So this is a really nice option if you have any sort of loaf pan. So I've just been doing it this way.
And have you tried this recipe, Lacey, with just baking the whole thing on a stone or just on a baking pan instead of in a shaped item?
No, I haven't. I've either done it in a banneton or in a loaf pan.
Yeah, it'd be interesting to see how it would come out just on a stone the whole time, even with your steam, or on a baking sheet.
Yeah, well, I made 3 of these, so I'll bake one of them not in anything, and I'll send you all a picture tomorrow. We'll see how it turns out. So I'll do one in a loaf, one in the cast iron, and one on a baking sheet, and we'll see what they look like. Because they'll all get baked tomorrow morning. All right, y'all, if you don't have any more questions, that's all I had for you this evening.
Can you just show us what those holders look like? Right next to your arm, the black things?
These?
Yeah.
Oh, they're just like silicone.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. I wouldn't say they're excellent, but like, they work for me anyways. I don't think Phil likes them very much, but I like them.
I recommend UV gloves. I have never burned my hands wearing UV gloves. And when you're picking up the cast iron or the ceramic after it's been in the oven, those things get really hot.
Yeah.
So a friend of mine turned me onto the UV gloves, and I'm a big fan now.
Nice and crusty. I see where it's connected to this side. There we go.
Looks gorgeous.
Yeah. And it's a nice, like, big enough loaf for, you know, making your bread, your sandwiches or whatever, but you could also just, you know, toast it up, put an egg on it. So yeah, that's it. It feels a little soft. Like I said, I probably would have gone a little bit longer on this.
Lacey, do you ever keep your sourdough starters in direct sunlight, like through a window?
Not intentionally, but sometimes like we get morning light and I'll have my sourdough over here and I do try to like pull the curtain to protect it. So I've never had an issue with that, but we also don't have a very bright kitchen when it comes to light.
Okay.
I probably wouldn't if you can help it. Or just use like a longer towel to put around it.
Yeah.
Can you describe the texture of what the bread's gonna be like? Is it gonna be spongy or is it gonna be more firm?
This one with the sweet potato in it is definitely like a softer bread, kind of like if you've had potato rolls. It's not as soft as like a Hawaiian potato roll, or like what I grew up with like these really soft breads. But it definitely is like a softer bread for sourdough. Yeah, and like I said, the sourdough in general always tends to have like a little bit more of a moisture to it than yeasted breads. So even though this needs another hour, let's go ahead and cut it open so we can just see what it looks like in there. All right, so I can see that this needed more time and it needs more time to steam, right? So it's like a little bit wet, but generally, like that's what I was expecting, was like fairly dense network here, like some larger air bubbles here, but like mostly I was, you know, looking for a sandwich bread that wasn't going to have like too many holes in it. But if we had let it, you know, steam more properly, then I would expect it to be like a little drier in here.
So another 10 minutes or so, do you think?
I think so, yeah. I think another 10 minutes would have been like perfect. The other thing that I've come across a lot with sourdough, and I don't make yeasted breads very often, so I don't know that this is the same with yeasted breads, but like it'll come out of the oven like super crusty like this, and then I'll stick it on my counter, like on my breadboard, and then the next day you go to cut it and it's like very soft and like wobbly. And that just has to do with the humidity in our environment here. Like if you're not using air conditioning or heat, and like you're just having like the open elements in the mid-Atlantic, like we just have humid environment, and it affects the bread. The way that I like to store the bread is to cut it and put it face down on the loaf pan or whatever, however you're storing it. I don't wrap it in plastic. Sometimes I'll put like a paper bag over it just so that like my cat doesn't mess with it. But generally we just you know, keep it just like this on the counter for maybe 3 days. And then after that, I'll slice it into thin slices and stick it in the freezer and then toast it to refresh it whenever I want to use it from there. But for usually 2 to 3 days, it's fine. And as long as you keep that cut side down, like this part will be just fine. Like it'll stay really soft in here. And that reminds me of like the tradition of these communal ovens that were all over Europe, and makes me think of my aunt in particular who grew up in Greece, and they would do once a week baking. They would bake a loaf for every day, so they would bake 7 loaves, and they would store those loaves. They just had like in their kitchen, they had like 7 little cubbies basically that they would store the loaves in, and the bread will kind of cure if you don't cut into it. So if you let it bake and then don't cut into it and just let it sit, it'll cure and kind of form a deeper crust, and it'll be good for, you know, almost a week without cutting into it at all. So that is one big difference between sourdough and yeasted breads, is that I feel like yeasted breads don't tend to have the same shelf life as a sourdough bread. But on the flip side, like once you start cutting into it, like sourdough bread, I've never had a sourdough bread mold. It'll just turn into a crouton, basically. It'll just get really dry.
Any last questions before we sign out?
I want to thank you, Lacey. I learned a lot tonight.
Thank you very much, Lacey. I appreciate it.
Yeah, my pleasure. Thank you for sharing your knowledge as well, everyone.
Thanks, Lacey. Mine is on its second 10-minute time frame, so I'm baking tonight too.
Yay. Good. All right, I will send you some pictures of what the other ones turn out looking like, and we're gonna eat this and I'll send you some results.
Perfect.
Thanks.
Thank you.
All right.
Thank you very much.
Take care.
Bye.
Bye.